Napalm Death wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel. They're trying to smash it into dust. Scum wasn't just an album. It was a middle finger to convention. A tornado of noise that turned punk, metal, and hardcore inside out. Most interestingly, they did it in just 33 minutes. No frills, no fat, just 28 bursts of pure unfiltered aggression. Birmingham in the early 80s was a bleak place. But out of that industrial wasteland came a band that would redefine extremity. Napalm Death had been kicking around since 1981, going through lineup changes, demo recordings, brief dormancy before solidifying their vision in 1985. At the center of it all was the core trio. Nicholas Bullen on vocals and bass, Justin Broderick on guitar, and Miles Ratledge behind the kit. They found a home at the Mermaid, a punk club run by Daz Russell, who turned Napalm Death into its unofficial house band. In return, they helped keep the club alive, bringing in enough rowdy punks to fund the foreign bands Russell booked. Supporting acts like Anti-C-Mex, Sacrilege, and the Verruchers, Napalm Death became the local scene's relentless sonic assault squad. But the lineup didn't remain stable for long. This was a band in constant mutation, a living, breathing entity fueled by chaos. Peter Shaw briefly joined on bass, freeing up Bullen to focus solely on vocals, but by that time they recorded Hatred Surge. Sean and Ratledge were both out of there. Then came Mick Harris in the late 85, a drummer whose sole mission in life seemed to be playing faster than humanly possible. Inspired by US hardcore maniacs Siege and Deep Wound, Harris took speed and aggression to a level that made punk and metal sound quaint in comparison. By early 86, with a new lineup and an even more unhinged energy, they hit the stage alongside Amoebics and Instigators, proving that they weren't just getting faster, they're also getting sharper. March 1986 saw them in Flick Studios, grinding out From Enslavement to Obliteration, a demo that distilled this anarchy punk fury with Celtic Frost-inspired riffage and Harris's ungodly blast beats. And that was the turning point. The final ingredient had been added, and grindcore, though nobody had really called it that yet, was officially a force to be reckoned with. But of course, we are talking about Scum, and you definitely don't need me to tell you what that did for heavy music. It's there in every heaviest albums of all time list, name-checked by bands that pushed extremity into every single direction. Pig Destroyer, Full of Hell, and countless others built their careers on the rubble Napalm Death left behind. But Scum's influence goes beyond grindcore, beyond metal, even beyond rock itself. It shattered expectations of what music could be. If you call yourself a fan of heavy music and haven't spent time with Scum, your butthole will pucker with delight with this one cranked in the cans. But back in 1987, there weren't a million different flavors of heavy music. You didn't have a Spotify algorithm curating the perfect cocktail of hardcore punk rage, metal theatrics, and underground sneer. Scenes were tight-knit, walled off, guarded by purists who did not take kindly to outsiders. And then Napalm Death came along and took a wrecking ball to the whole damn thing. Scum wasn't just an album, it was like a declaration of war. A violent collision of metal and punk that smashed down the barriers between the two and left behind something entirely new. Grindcore. Now before Scum, UK punk had a political edge, but it was often wrapped in layers of vague nihilism. No future, all that good stuff. The anger was there, but the target wasn't always clear. Napalm Death didn't have time for poetic abstractions. They're here to tear into the machine fast and loud. They weren't interested in easy, anti-monarchy slogans or cartoonish rebellion. Scum was an all-out assault on the suffocating grip of capitalism, the meat grinder of consumer culture, and the blood-soaked gears of industry. Every supermarket aisle, every fast food burger, every drop of oil, it all came at a cost. And Napalm Death was making damn sure you heard the human and animal suffering behind it. And when your songs average about a minute long, there's no room for being vague anyhow. And what makes Scum even more fascinating isn't just its breakneck intensity, it's how it was made. Most bands struggle with lineup changes across albums. Scum couldn't even keep the same lineup for the entire recording. Side A and B were recorded by two almost entirely different versions of Napalm Death, with only drummer Mick Harris sticking around for both. The first half featured Nick Bullen on vocals and bass, Justin Broderick on guitar, Harris on the kit. By the time they got to side B, that lineup had been obliterated. Lee Dorian was now on vocals, Jim Whiteley on bass, and Bill Steer was handling the guitars. It was less of a band and more of a rotating wrecking crew of noise fanatics, each pushing the chaos just a bit further. And within this half hour of mayhem, Scum gave us You Suffer, a song so brief, just over a second long, that it earned a Guinness Book World Record as the shortest song ever. Blink and you will definitely miss it. But in that single second, they captured the entire ethos of grindcore. Fast, brutal, totally to the point. Remastered, repressed, and still as violently uncompromising as it was in 1987, Scum is more than just a relic of extreme music's past. It's a reminder that sometimes all it takes is 28 songs and 33 minutes to permanently shift the trajectory of heavy music. And of course, before this album even came to be, Napalm Death had already been pushing their sound into uncharted territory. They had built their foundation on the most extreme music that they could get their hands on. Stuff that went well beyond punk's usual noisy discontent. Bolin and the company had been absorbing the aggression of Japanese hardcore groups like GISM, Kuro, and Crow, whose chaotic feedback-drenched assault made UK punk sound tame in comparison. And what made it even more interesting was that these Japanese bands had originally taken inspiration from early 80s UK hardcore, twisted it into something even wilder, and then sent it back out in the world. So here is Napalm Death taking that baton and running with it, pushing the sound to its most extreme limit, where some songs blurred into pure sonic obliteration. But Japan wasn't the only international influence. Finland had its own breed of frantic hardcore, bands like Chaos, Cadgers, and Radis, that left a huge impression on Napalm Death. And the underground punk and hardcore network was a tight one, even before the internet. If you couldn't afford an import record, you could scrape together enough for a pack of blank tapes and some postage stamps. Through trading tapes across Europe, the UK, and beyond, the band soaked up ideas from every extreme music scene that they could tap into. And when Scum finally dropped, it wasn't just a local phenomenon. It fired right back out into the international underground, inspiring this new wave of noise freaks across the globe. By late 1986, Napalm Death had caught the attention of Digby Pearson, the man behind the newly formed Earache Records. Now, Pearson had gotten a hold of their recordings via Justin Broderick, and by March of '87, he signed them. He bought the master tapes from the 1986 sessions and booked studio time for more recording. What followed was a process that could only be described as barely controlled chaos. Harris and Bill Steer had written 16 new songs. Harris, despite not playing guitar, had tuned down the A and the E strings and banged out the riffs on a tape recorder just to get the ideas down. Whiteley handled most of the lyrics, while Dorian scrambled to add some last-minute touches the night before they entered the studio. And in true Napalm Death fashion, they had exactly one 3-hour rehearsal before laying it all down in May of 1987. So now, Side A of Scum was actually recorded months earlier, in August of 1986, by what was essentially a different lineup: Harris on drums, Broderick on guitar, Bolin on bass and vocals, and it was supposed to be just another demo. Napalm Death had no label interest, and Russell, the promoter from the Mermaid, had offered to release a single or a split on his fledgling indie label. The band recorded the tracks at Rich Bitch Studios in Birmingham over the next 2 days, taking advantage of the studio's lower nighttime rates. About 20 friends, members of Head of David, Unseen Terror, and even Damian Thompson from Sacrilege crowded into the sessions, throwing in ideas, lending gear, and soaking up the madness of the whole thing. And the material at that point was a mix of different eras of Napalm Death's evolution. Some riffs dated back to Broderick's ideas from 1983, while others were built on fragments of Hatred Surge, the band's earlier demo. Tracks like The Kill, You Suffer, Death by Manipulation were already in the mix, but the Scum versions took things up another notch. Faster, more violent, even more compressed into their signature microbursts of rage. And Russell had fronted the money for the sessions, but in the end, Napalm Death refused to hand over the master tapes. They had played enough unpaid gigs for him at the Mermaid and weren't about to give away any of their recordings for nothing. Instead, the tapes made their way to Pearson, and with the addition of the newly recorded Side B in May of 1987, Scum was complete. It was a Frankenstein of an album, yet somehow fully formed in its mission to take speed, heaviness, and intensity to a place that no one had really dared before. And Napalm Death wasn't the first band to play fast, and they certainly weren't the first to write songs that could be measured in seconds instead of minutes. Hardcore scenes around the world had already been experimenting with speed and brevity. Bands like Crab Society North were already cranking out microscopic songs, and there were underground acts playing just as fast, if not faster. But Scum wasn't about speed alone. It was a violent mutation of styles that could only have come from England, a place where punk and metal were still mortal enemies, each side thinking the other was either too soft or too damn stupid. But then Napalm Death actually ripped that divide into shreds. Imagine Discharge colliding head-on with Celtic Frost, two completely different worlds smashing together to create something uglier and meaner than either of them could have done on their own. That's Scum. Some tracks are pure speed freak hardcore. The Kill, Polluted Minds, and the legendary You Suffer were over before he even registered what the hell was even happening. Others had this push and pull between sludgy, crushing riffs and sudden uncontrolled bursts of just insanity. Songs like Scum, the title track, Control, and Caught in a Dream felt like they were being torn apart in real time. One moment locking into a punishingly heavy groove, the next spiraling into total anarchy. And then there was Siege of Power, the closest thing the album had to an actual metal song. Slower, weightier, but still carrying that same throat-grabbing aggression, with Mick Harris injecting an actual pulse into the track rather than just trying to out-blast himself. And of course, by the time they recorded Side B, Napalm Death barely resembled the band that had started the album, with Lee Dorian on vocals, Bill Steer on guitar, Jim Whiteley on bass, though he wouldn't last long before Shane Embury actually would replace him. And of course, you still had Harris hammering away on the kit, and the tension had been brewing for a while. Bullen had been losing interest in the group, shifting his focus toward academics, stepping away from music altogether. Broderick, frustrated with the direction Napalm Death was heading, split after a gig in Leeds, with Sacrilege to drum for Head of David, a band that had gained more traction at the time thanks to a deal with Blast First, the same label that handled Sonic Youth. His initial replacement was Frank Healy, but soon enough they found their guy in Bill Steer. He was a 16-year-old guitar prodigy at the time, who would later carve his own path with Carcass. But by the time the dust settled, Scum had become this monstrosity of its own. The new lineup had a bit more leaning into its heavy metal influences, but still had not abandoned the rabid energy of their punk roots. And Scum is one of those albums that's as much of a debate as it is a record. You got the people who swear by it, who see it as the defining moment extreme music really took its final leap into just pure mayhem. And then there's the people who think Side B is where the whole thing just goes to complete shit. Just tuneless noise with none of the hooks, structure, or intensity that made Side A so damn lethal. But whatever side you land on, there's no denying that Scum is really two albums by two different bands held together by one drummer and a whole hell of a lot of feedback. Interestingly though, the influence of Side B will be heard in later music as well. For people who love the influence of Discharge, Celtic Frost colliding at breakneck speed, then the later tracks, with their seemingly directionless bursts of sound, felt like a step too far into the void. It was less brutality with a pulse and more of a free fall into total audio destruction. A sound that would later be picked up by bands like Anal Cunt and others who embrace the pure chaos of noise over anything resembling traditional songcraft. But no matter where you stand on Scum, it definitely shaped extreme music forever. If Side A gave us grindcore's blueprint, Side B gave us its extremely wild side. And this would shape power violence and noisecore bands who would build their entire identities around the loss of hooks, flat abrasive guitar tone, and unrelenting cymbal bashing. And of course, for players out there who are looking to recreate this wild sonic stew, you would need gear that sounds as ugly as the music itself. A crank solid-state amp maybe, some kind of gnarly fuzz pedal, or one of those throwaway BBE distortions with every knob maxed out. Basically anything that turns your tone into a wall of buzzing, blown-out noise. And Scum doesn't just ease you in, it lures you into a false sense of security before throwing you straight into the meat grinder. The opener, Multinational Corporations, might be the slowest, most restrained track on the entire album, but yet it's still all tension. Layers of feedback groan in the background. The bass rumbles like something crawling out of a sewer. Cymbals crash like distant explosions, and all over it, Nick Bullen chants Multinational Corporations, genocide of the starving nation. It's not music, it's like a warning. And then Instinct of Survival hits, and all hell breaks loose. Justin Broderick lays down a riff that wouldn't sound out of place on a Black Flag album. Mick Harris jumps in with a classic hardcore skank beat, and for a brief moment, it almost sounds like you're about to get a traditional punk song. But that moment doesn't even last. Harris slams down the accelerator, launching into a blast beat so relentless it feels like the speakers are being shredded in real time. Bullen's vocals shift from this bark to this monstrous guttural snarl, and just like that, grindcore has officially arrived. The guitars didn't just have distortion, they sounded like they were covered in mud and gasoline. The bass didn't just add low end, it was this growling, overdriven wrecking ball that sounded like the amps were about to short circuit. Broderick and later Bill Steer pushed their guitars into a realm that was not metal, wasn't punk, it was just pure sonic carnage. Every riff leaving trails of feedback in its wake. And compared to Scum, even the filthiest hardcore records of the early 80s sound downright clean. GBH and The Exploited had a sharp, overdriven crunch, but next to Napalm Death, they may as well have been playing jazz fusion. And meanwhile, metal bands at the time were dialing in clearer, more precise tones, scooping their mids, refining the distortion for maximum impact. Scum did the opposite. It just cranked everything, mids and all, into a wall of blown-out noise. There was none of this tightness or clarity, just a constant suffocating roar. And even the production was a total mess, actually in the best possible way. The distortion was so over the top that it's impossible to tell how much is coming from the amps and pedals, and how much is just the recording itself being overloaded. And yet somehow, the mix works. The guitars and the bass are fighting for space, but they never disappear completely. Harris's blast beats are a constant barrage, yet you can still pick out the transients of the snare and the cymbals cutting through the haze. It may not be an audiophile's dream, but Scum was never meant for careful listening anyhow. It was meant to be a nice, pleasant brick to the face. A record that doesn't just push boundaries. It sets them on fire and buries them underneath a landslide of distortion. And by the time Scum was even finished, Napalm Death had already torn itself apart. It wasn't surprising. Everybody wanted control. There was no room for compromise in a band built on pure chaos anyhow. Bolin had already started checking out mentally. His interest in Napalm Death and music in general was just fading. But either way, even as the members moved on into death metal, industrial or experimental noise, or academia, the debris from Scum still lingers in heavy music today. To my subscribers, you are freaking awesome. Thank you so much for all your wonderful comments. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe yet, make sure you smack that subscribe button extremely hard. Smack the damn thing so much that it just literally freaking breaks. And while you're at it, do the same thing with the like button as well. It's all about destruction anyhow. But nevertheless, join the family, and I want to thank you so much for watching.